And now we're on Daf Mem Ches Omid Beis. So the Gemara says, wait a minute, Mikana Tolamed? You're telling me that the requirement of Tzafon is derived from here? Halok Kvar Nemar, b'mok mashed tishachar ha'ol tishachar ha'chatos. So why do we need that pasuk when we have the pasuk b'mok mashed tishachar ha'ol tishachar ha'chatos? The chatos has to be shechted in the tzafon. Halom yatzah. Now, it's interesting that this pasuk that the Gemara is now invoking in terms of shechting the chatos is referring to which chatos? The chatos of the nasi. L'kval makom. So the Gemara says, I need this pasuk to teach you shino lava kasuv liake, that im lo shchata b'tzofon pasuk. That tzafon is an absolute indispensable requirement, and without tzafon, the carbon is possible. How do you know that the reason why the Torah had to tell you chatos is like the ola in the case of the nasi, of the chatos han-nasi? Oh, wait, no, maybe I would counter argue and say elazet ton tzafon v'yein acher ton tzafon. Maybe the Torah is specifying nasi, that the chatos of a nasi requires tzafon, but no other chatos requires tzafon. Rashi adds no other chatos of a soyer, right? Because we know that that a chatos in general requires tzafon. Talmud lomar v'shachat es hachatos b'makom ole, and the makom ole is going to certainly teach you that we go beyond the chatos v'nasi zebanav l'chol chatos sheyu te'unos tzafon. Frekti Gemara ashkechan sa'ir l'nasi, and now the Torah had repeated the requirement of tzafon in the case of sa'ir nasi bein l'mitzvah bein l'kiv, to teach you that's even ma'akev. Shar chatos ashkel l'mitzvah l'akev. You know, how do we know that in other chatos it's absolutely indispensable that the shechita and the kabbalah take place in the tzafon? D'chsiv b'kizba uksiv b'seira. Right, the requirement of what? Of tzafon appears in the pasuk of kizba lechatos, and in the pasuk right before there of a soyer lechatos. So we got kizba lechatos and soyer lechatos. Okay, fine. Now we have the word oso. Ela oso lamalu. Right, because the Brisa says that oso is not coming limu'ute seiri chatos. So what is oso coming to exclude? Oso batzofon, the ain soyer nachshon batzofon. Okay, so now we get into a sugi called soyer nachshon, which means at the time of the Chanukas ha-Mishkan, the Nesiim brought their karbanos for the Chanukah, for the dedication, and the first one in the list was Nachshon. Now, Nachshon brings us Sawyer, and what we're going to learn about Nachshon Sawyer is true for all the other 11 Shvatim as well, but just we're focused on Nachshon because he's the first. Tanya, we learned to the Brisa of Samach Yadol Rosh HaSawyer, L'Rabo Sawyer Nachshon. We need a special ribui, even though in general a chatos requires smicha, and in fact at the time the smicha did vidu, but nevertheless in the case of the chatos of the hakomas hamishkan, of the chanukas hamishkan, we need a special pasuk to teach me smicha. Divrei Rabbi Yehuda, Rabbi Shimon Omer, no, I'm going to take the ribui of v'samach yadol rosh hasoyer, and I'm going to say it has nothing to do with Sa'ir Nachshon, but rather Sa'iri Avodas Kocham L'Smicha. That the Sa'ir, when the Rov Tzibur violates unintentionally Avodah Zarah, then we bring a Sa'ir, and there's a requirement to Smicha on the Sa'ir. So now, the Gemara is getting back to that extra word S. What is that S coming to exclude? And the Gemara is going to focus now on the Shita of Rabbi Yehuda, that a Soyer Nachshon does not require smicha. Salket, I would have thought, oh, this Rabu is smicha. Is Rabu nami litzafon, komash malon. I need the S to teach me that even the Soyer of Nachshon, I would think, requires tzafon. And why is that? Because we had a special ribuy of a samach yada rosh hasoyer to include soyer nachshon. So maybe we should include soyer nachshon even in the requirement of tzafon. Kamash malon. No, S teaches me that the soyer nachshon chatos does not have to be tzafon. I never understood why the Gemara is spending so much time on soyer nachshon. Like what's the nafkamina? It's Hilchos Olam Mashiach. What? Anyway. Maskiv lo Ravina. Ravina asked the kasha. Hanichal Rabbi Yehuda. Okay, so you worked it out with Rabbi Yehuda, and he holds that the chatos of the Hakomas Hamishkan requires smicha, and therefore you might have a hot minute to require tzafon as well, and therefore we need the S. But the Rabbi Shimon, what do you say according to Rabbi Shimon? Well, why do you need an S to exclude the requirement of tzafon in the case of soyer nachshon? I mean, what would have been the basis for such a thing? Because according to Reb Shimon, that chatos that nachshon brought does not require smicha. So I would certainly assume if it doesn't require smicha, it doesn't require tzafon. I don't even think you worked it out well according to Rabbi Yehuda. You're only attacking from the Chachamim's point of view, Reb Shimon's point of view. L'mai dis Rabbi is Rabbi, l'mai de lo is Rabbi, lo is Rabbi. Right? You have this chatos nachshon, and we have a ribui, and we're going to only use the ribui to include that which it includes. Right? So you want to include smicha, okay, fine. That's Rabbi Yehuda Shita. It comes to include shchita, smicha, excuse me. But now you want to add tzafon to boot. Well, why would you do such a thing? And you'll say, "Ilo ma'ate kra havamina tesi b'vinyan av." Okay, fine. You know what? If I didn't have S, I would use a binyan av, and I would say that a binyan av would tell me that smicha is a requirement for the chatas of nachshon, and therefore maybe we should require tzafon for the smicha guf of teisiv binyan av. But what does this mean? Smicha guf teisiv binyan. Anyway, the thrust of Mar Zutra's kasha is I don't understand Rabbi Yehuda either. Rabbi Yehuda is also equally difficult because Rabbi Yehuda takes this ribui of V'samach Yado Rosh HaSoyer to include Chatos Nachshon. Why do I need that? You want to include Chatos Nachshon in Smicha, I'm going to derive that from a Binyan Av. He says here, because in the Pasuk regarding a Chatos, it says V'samachas Yado Rosh HaChatos. It could have said Ha-Chatos. Why does it say Rosh HaChatos? To teach me that anything that's called a Chatos requires Smicha. So why do I need the special ribui of Rabbi Yehuda to include the Chatos of Nachshon in the requirement of Smicha? Ella Midoros Lo Gamrinon. Right? We don't derive conclusions from the requirements of chatos throughout all the generations and derive conclusions by analogy for the chatos that was brought at the time of the Chanukah Samishkan. Is hachinami regarding tzafon is midoros lo gamrinon. So therefore, the Gemara is saying now at this point, I don't need S for the case of chatos nachshon. Frek the Gemara vela also betzafon. V'ein shoche betzafon. maybe if we got stuck and we still have no solution to the problem, what do we derive from S? What exclusion? Maybe we'll exclude the feet of the Kohen. The feet of the Kohen did not have to be in the Tzofa. So Gemara rejects it. Shochet mida Rabbi Achia Nafka. From Rabbi Achia's derivation, we're going to derive the conclusion of the Shochet himself. The Sanya Rabbi Achaya Omer v'Shochet Sol Yerech HaMizbech Tzofon U'Matamid Lomar Lefi Shematzinu Omer B'Tzofon V'Kal B'Tzofon Omer B'Doram V'Kiv B'Tzofon Pasul. If he was makabel the dam in the Tzofon, but he was standing in the Doram, is Yachal Af Zeh. Should we apply this also to the Shochet? Talmud Lomar Oso. Oso b'tzofim vein ha-shochet b'tzofim. So it's very interesting. As far as Kabbalah is concerned, the Kohen's feet have to be firmly rooted in the tzofim. But as far as Ola is concerned, because we derive from also that the Kohen doesn't have to stand with his feet in the sofa. Now the Gemara has another pshat. Because now that you've decided that ein hashochet b'tzafon, and we're going to derive that from Rav Achia, then we don't need the S. So what are we going to do with S? Ela oso batzofon, v'ein ben of batzofon. So the chatas of a nasi has to be shechted in the tzofon, but ben of batzofon doesn't require tzofon. It was very interesting, as we said at the outset of this daf, that the requirement of tzafon may reflect different kinds and categories of genus of animals, and the birds are excluded from the requirement of tzafon v'dinu, and I'll derive it from logic. Uma ben son shelo kavalo kohen kafalo tzafon. When we're talking about shchita, we don't require a Kohen for Shechita. Shechita is Ksher B'Zar. And yet, the Shechita has to take place in Safon, is Ben Ov Shekovalo Kohen. Which means the parallel of Shechita and Ov is called Malika. That has to be implemented by a Kohen. Is Eno Din Sheyikvelot Safon. How much more so? If you require Safon in a case of Son, right? Then how much more so in the case of oath? And what's the basis of this Kal V'chomer? Is that in the case of tzon, shechita could be done by a zar. That's not true in the case of an oath. The malik has to be done by a kohen. So again, based on this logic, we would now come to the conclusion that a ben oath is going to require tzafon. Is Talmud Lomar also, now we need the pasuk also, that only the chatos of a nasi has to be slaughtered, in the tzafon, but an oaf does not need shchita b'tzafon. It doesn't need shchita at all, but malika, which is ma liven oaf shekain kavalo kli. How can you possibly derive conclusions from ben tzon to an oath? Ben tzon requires a kli. In the case of malika, the kohen, after he does the malika of the oath, he pushes the bird against the side of the mizbeach, but he doesn't do kabbalah sadam. There's no kabbalah sadam. So again, now that we slugged up the Kal V'chomer, we don't have any right to say that the malika of an oath requires tzafon. So why do you need the S to exclude it? Ela also batzofan v'ein pesach batzofan. I might think that the shechita of a korban pesach requires tzofan, and then the pasuk S comes to exclude it. The Sanya of Elazar and Yaakov Omer Yochel Ye Pesach Ton Tzofan V'dinu, and I would think it's logical. Ma Ola Shekain Lo Kaval Lo Zman L'Shchitaso, right? You could shech the Ola whenever you want. And nevertheless, Kaval Lo Zman, you need that the Shechita take place in the Tzofan. Is Pesach, which is more Chomer, Shekaval Lo Zman L'Shchitaso. You have a very limited window of time, and Erev Pesach before Shechita is Edo Din Sheik Velotzon. How much more so it makes sense to derive the conclusion that you need Tzofan. Talmud Lober also, and there I need also. You can't derive any chumras in the avoda from Ola, and then you're going to derive conclusions about a korban Pesach. That can't be, because Ola is kula kolil. I mean, the Pesach is eaten. I mean, it has to be eaten. I think Gemara says mechatos. So the Kavachomer now is not from Ola, because Ola is Lagamri Kolil, Kuli Kolil, but rather from Chatos, which is not Kuli Kol, but Malachas Shekem Echad Pesach Chayvi increases. I mean, Korban Pesach has no power of atonement. It's not brought for atonement, but a Chatos is Mechaper on even a Chay of Krisus. So Gemara says, let's learn a couple of chomer from Hashem. Well, Ma'ala Hashem Shekei Kodshim Kodshim. And Korban Pesach is Kodshim Kalim. It's not Kodshim Kodshim. Mikulo Nami Shekein Kodshim Kodshim. So let's have a binyan, what's it called, a tzad shava. And we're going to say that they're all Kodshim Kodshim. Yeah, but that's not going to help you. Why? Because Korban Pesach is not Kodshim Kodshim. So how would you know that the requirement of how would you have a hamin that the requirement of Osham should apply to Korban Pesach based on Osham and Ola? That the word also is coming to exclude the Kohen doesn't have to stand in the tzofan. His feet could be firmly grounded outside the tzofan. And then you ask the question, we already derived this halacha that the shochet could be standing outside of the tzofan from Rav Achya's interpretation of a pasuk. So this is very interesting. Now the Gemara is going to apply a principle where sometimes a miyut could become a ribui. Lav l'mu'utei shochet b'tzofan. So the word S in Chatos Nosi is not coming to teach me that the shochet doesn't have to be standing in the tzofan, Ella, because the fact that the shochet doesn't have to have his feet in the tzofan, we already derived from Achia. Ella ein shochet b'tzofan, aval makabel b'tzofan. That even though in Shechita the Kohen could be outside of the tzofan, but he's got to come inside for the Kabbalah Saddam. That's going to be quite a feat. And how do we know this? From the word lokach. Makabel mi lokach v'lokach nafka. All right, we have Gzeir Shava of lokach v'lokcha, or if you want to cut the word into half. And then we're going to derive the conclusion that only in the case of a chatas nasi does the Kohen have to be standing in the tzofan. And if that be the case, I don't need S. The Gemara answers v'lokach v'locha lo mashmaleh. So he doesn't have this drasha of v'lokach v'lokach, and therefore he has to derive the halacha of Kabbalah from Chatas Nasi, that we need tzofan. Ashkan shchita v'yola lemitzvah, but Kabbalah nami lemitzvah ashkan shchita v'Kabbalah yakabi nalon. Amar Rav Ado bar Ava v'itei Rav Zim kal v'chomer. Again, even though normally a kal v'chomer doesn't derive onshim, but if you're talking about the requirements of avoda, we can certainly derive them from logical kal v'chomer. Ola. Chatas itself is a derivative of ola in terms of its requirement of tzafon, and that tzafon is makeves, is ola sheba chatas mikocha. Right, chatas is a derivative from ola. Ola is the original. Is eno din shema keves. Right, we were trying to figure out how do we know that the requirement of tzafon in ola is ma'akev, is likuva. The answer is we're going to derive ola and kavachom from chatas, because the whole requirement of tzafon in chatas is derived from ola. And if in chatas the Torah repeats itself to teach me that tzafon is likuva, then how much more so in the original, the teacher has to be tzafon likuva, and therefore an ola has to be tzafon likuva. Gemara says, but again, when you're going to compare chatas to an ola, we're going to always have a pircha, because chatas is more chomer and more powerful than an ola. Malach chatas shekei mechaper salchai increases. Omer Avina ha kashali l'Rav Ada bar Ava klum matzinu tafel chomer min ha'ikar. So now the Gemara is going to embark on a whole new sugya. Can you derive B from A, and B as a derivative now stands on its own and becomes more chomer with a higher demand and requirement than A, even though A was the malamed. And the Gemara is going to go through many, many different sugyas in order to see and judge whether there is such a thing. Right. Okay, then. Thank you very much.
Okay, okay, Shkoyach. Did you get in touch, or did you get in touch with Barry Braidowitz?
I'll be honest with you.
Yeah, he's not responding.